First contact and captivity. The deep space exploration vessel Horizon drifted silently through the inky blackness, its sensors probing the unknown reaches of the Andromeda sector. Ethan Rodriguez sat at the navigation console, his fingers dancing across holographic displays, tracking the minute variations in stellar radiation that might indicate something extraordinary. At 35, Ethan was no stranger to the unexpected. A veteran of 3 deep space missions, he had developed a reputation for calm under pressure and an uncanny ability to read subtle environmental shifts. His dark eyes, marked by laugh lines that spoke of countless hours of quiet humor, scanned the endless cosmic canvas before him. Anomaly detected, the ship's AI announced, its synthetic voice cutting through the ambient hum of the vessel's systems. Quantum signature inconsistent with known spatial configurations. Ethan leaned forward, his muscular frame tensing. In his years of exploration, he had learned that anomalies were either nothing or everything. There was rarely an in-between. The ship shuddered, not the violent tremor of an impact, but something more calculated, precise, as if an invisible hand had reached out and plucked the horizon from its trajectory like a child selecting a toy. "Emergency protocols," Ethan commanded, but before the AI could respond, a wave of energy swept through the bridge. His vision blurred, muscles locked, consciousness slipping away like sand through an hourglass. When Ethan awoke, the sterile environment was nothing like the warm blues and grays of the horizon. Smooth metallic walls curved in impossible geometries, reflecting a light source he couldn't pinpoint. The room, if it could be called a room, felt more like a containment pod than a cell. His first attempt to move confirmed he was restrained, not by traditional handcuffs or chains, but by a field of energy that seemed to respond to his slightest movement, tightening with a cold, intelligent precision. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time lost meaning in this alien environment. Then she arrived. The guard was tall, easily 7 feet in height, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that seemed to shift between gold and amber. Her movements were calculated, each step a perfect measurement of efficiency and purpose. Unlike human military personnel, she wore no obvious weapon, yet Ethan understood immediately that she was dangerous. "Designation?" she asked, her voice a complex harmonic that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his mind. "Ethan Rodriguez, space explorer, prisoner apparently." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral. Years of diplomatic training kicked in, suppressing the fear and curiosity that threatened to burst through his carefully maintained composure. The guard's eyes, those remarkable shifting eyes, studied him, not with malevolence but with a clinical detachment that felt more scientific than threatening. "Your vessel entered restricted space," she stated. It wasn't an accusation, more like a fact being entered into a log. Ethan knew better than to argue or explain. Alien encounters were delicate, and humans had learned, sometimes painfully, that communication was more art than science when dealing with extraterrestrial intelligence. "I understand," he replied simply. Something flickered in her expression, not emotion precisely, more like recognition, as if his measured response was unexpected. She moved closer, each step perfectly measured. A handheld device, if such a term could describe the complex crystalline object in her hand, scanned him. Not invasively, but with a precision that suggested layers of information being processed simultaneously. "You will remain here," she said, not a threat, a statement of fact. As she turned to leave, Ethan caught a glimpse of something unusual, a hesitation, the barest moment where her movements weren't perfectly choreographed. His capture was complete, but something told him this was just the beginning of a much larger story. Little did Ethan know how profoundly this moment would change everything he understood about space, communication, and the potential for connection between 2 seemingly incompatible species. Breaking the silence, the rhythmic pulse of artificial light became Ethan's only companion. Days, or what passed for days in this alien environment, blended into an endless cycle of observation and isolation. His containment area, a marvel of technological design, seemed to anticipate his every movement. When he approached one wall, it would subtly shift, creating invisible barriers that guided him back to the center. His guard, the copper-skinned alien whose name he had yet to learn, maintained a strict routine of observation. She would enter precisely at regular intervals, her scanning device capturing every nuance of his existence. Ethan had been trained in xenological protocols, understanding that first-contact scenarios demanded patience, observation, and a complete absence of threatening behavior. On what felt like the fifth cycle of his captivity, Ethan decided to break the monotonous silence. "Do you have a name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and neutral. The guard paused, not a dramatic halt but a microscopic hesitation that most would have missed. Her amber-gold eyes locked onto him, processing, analyzing. "Designation is irrelevant," she responded, her harmonics carrying a tone that suggested communication was a mere procedural requirement. Ethan smiled internally. A response was a response, and in xenological interactions, that was progress. "I'm Ethan," he continued, choosing a deliberately non-threatening approach. "I'm a cartographer and explorer. My mission was to map uncharted regions of space." The guard's scanning device hummed, its crystalline surface capturing data points that Ethan could only imagine. Was she recording his linguistic patterns, analyzing his physiological responses? "Unauthorized space penetration is a violation," she stated, her words carrying the weight of institutional judgment. "Exploration is how civilizations grow," Ethan countered, careful to keep his tone conversational rather than argumentative. "How else do we understand the universe around us?" Another pause, longer this time. The guard moved closer, her movements a study in calculated precision. Up close, Ethan noticed intricate patterns etched into her skin, not tattoos, but something more akin to biological circuitry. Microscopic lines that seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence. "Your species is known for geographical transgression," she said, a hint of something, judgment perhaps, coloring her harmonics. Ethan recognized the opening, a chance to provide context, to humanize his species' exploratory nature. "We're curious," he explained. "Not to conquer, but to understand. Every new star system, every uncharted region represents knowledge, potential." The guard's scanning device changed its rhythm, a subtle shift that might have meant nothing or everything. "Potential can be dangerous," she responded. "So can stagnation," Ethan replied, meeting her gaze directly. For the first time since his capture, something changed in her expression. Not emotion, precisely, but a recognition, as if she was genuinely processing his words rather than simply cataloging them. The containment field around him subtly adjusted, creating a marginally more comfortable configuration. Was it a response to their conversation? Ethan couldn't be certain. As she prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something extraordinary. The guard's movement was slightly less rigid. The perfect geometric precision of her earlier movements had developed the slightest hint of something else. Curiosity, consideration. Communication, Ethan knew, was never just about words. It was about creating bridges of understanding, one microscopic interaction at a time. Little did he know how profoundly these small moments would reshape both their destinies. Unexpected connection. The next cycle brought an unexpected shift in their dynamic. As the guard entered Ethan's containment area, she carried something different, a small crystalline container that reflected light in impossible geometric patterns. Her movements, once purely mechanical, now carried a hint of something more nuanced. "Sustenance adaptation protocol," she announced, placing the container near Ethan. Unlike the previous bland nutritional cubes he'd been provided, this contained what appeared to be a luminescent liquid. The substance shifted colors, from deep indigo to a shimmering silver green, as if alive with its own internal energy. Ethan recognized this as more than a routine feeding. It was a gesture, perhaps even an attempt at communication. "You're modifying my nutritional intake," he observed, careful to keep his tone neutral and analytical. The guard's amber-gold eyes flickered. Your physiological responses indicate nutritional deficiency. Adaptation is necessary for continued observation. A diplomatic way of saying she was trying to keep him healthy. Ethan couldn't help but smile internally. In the vast, cold universe of interstellar diplomacy, this was as close to kindness as one might expect. He carefully consumed the liquid. It tasted unlike anything he'd experienced, a complex symphony of flavors that seemed to change with each micro-moment of contact. Hints of something citrusy, then a depth reminiscent of rare minerals, followed by a warmth that spread through his body like liquid starlight. "Remarkable," Ethan murmured. The guard's ears, delicate, almost translucent appendages he'd barely noticed before, twitched slightly. A micro-response that suggested she was listening, truly listening. "Your species has limited sensory perception," she stated, but there was no condescension in her tone, more like a clinical observation. Ethan seized the opportunity. Different doesn't mean limited, just different. For the first time, something that might have been close to amusement flickered in her eyes. Not a smile. Her species likely didn't smile as humans understood it, but a subtle shift in her physiological response. "You interpret differences as potential," she said, more a statement of realization than a question. "Isn't that the foundation of exploration?" Ethan responded. "Understanding that what seems alien can become familiar, that communication is more than just exchanging words." The containment field around him adjusted again, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but Ethan had been trained to notice such things. This was no random occurrence. This was a response. She began scanning him, but the process felt different, less invasive, more collaborative. "Your neural pathways respond differently to stress," she observed. "Most captured specimens exhibit elevated cortisol levels, increased aggression. You demonstrate remarkable neural plasticity." Ethan chuckled. "Is that your way of saying I'm handling this well?" Another ear twitch, definitely communication. As she prepared to leave, she paused, a moment longer than necessary. Her hand, 4 long fingers with an iridescent membrane between them, hovered near a control panel. "What is your primary mission?" she asked, a rare moment of direct inquiry. Ethan considered his response carefully. Honesty but not complete exposure. "To understand," he said simply, "to map, to connect." The guard processed this. The crystalline scanning device hummed with increased intensity. "Connection," she repeated as if testing the word, trying to understand its deeper meaning. As she left, Ethan realized something profound was happening. This wasn't just about his capture anymore. This was becoming a dialogue, a bridge between two fundamentally different forms of intelligence. And bridges, he knew, could lead anywhere. Secrets and revelations. The ship's internal environment began to reveal its complexity. Ethan had started to notice patterns, subtle vibrations that seemed to pulse through the walls, rhythmic energy flows that suggested the vessel was more than a mere transportation device. It was alive in ways human technology could never comprehend. His guard, whose name he still didn't know, appeared less frequently now, but each interaction carried more weight. Her scanning devices had become less invasive, more conversational. Sometimes she would linger, her amber gold eyes studying him with an intensity that suggested she was piecing together a complex puzzle. During one of these extended interactions, something shifted. "Your mission was not random," she stated, the harmonics of her voice carrying a new undertone. Not accusation, something closer to curiosity. Ethan met her gaze. No mission is truly random in deep space exploration. A crystalline device materialized between them, not the scanning tool he was accustomed to, but something different. It projected a holographic map of star systems, with intricate lines connecting various points of light. Some regions pulsed with an ominous red glow. "You entered a zone of historical conflict," she said, her fingers tracing the holographic lines. Ethan studied the map. Conflict zones were always complex. In his years of exploration, he'd learned that borders were rarely as simple as they appeared. "Conflict from whose perspective?" he asked carefully. The guard's ears, those delicate, translucent appendages, twitched, a sign of internal processing he was beginning to recognize as her version of deep thought. "Perspective is a complex construct," she responded. "Your species has a history of territorial expansion, of misunderstanding." It wasn't an accusation, more like an invitation to explain. Ethan chose his words carefully. Exploration isn't about conquest, it's about understanding, learning. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. She activated another projection. This one showed his ship, the horizon, its trajectory mapped against a complex network of spatial boundaries. Red lines intersected his path, creating a web of forbidden zones. "You crossed multiple interdimensional protocols," she explained. "Your vessel's quantum signature triggered multiple defensive mechanisms." "Defensive," Ethan repeated, "not offensive." A pause, longer than usual. "The distinction is often academic," she said finally. Something was happening. Their conversations were evolving from interrogation to something more nuanced, an exchange of knowledge, of perspective. She began revealing fragments, not directly, but through carefully constructed holographic displays, glimpses of a conflict that predated human civilization, territorial disputes that spanned multiple star systems, protocols designed to prevent catastrophic interspecies misunderstandings. Ethan realized he was being given more than information. He was being offered context. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. Her response was unexpected. Understanding requires more than observation, it requires context. As she prepared to leave, she did something unprecedented. She touched a control panel near his containment field. The energy around him softened, became less restrictive. A gesture of trust, of something more. Ethan watched her leave, understanding that everything was changing. His capture was no longer just a scientific observation. It was becoming something else entirely. A bridge, a conversation, the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully comprehend. Rebellion and escape. The ship's internal rhythms had become familiar to Ethan. Each pulse, each subtle vibration told a story of complex technological symphonies far beyond human understanding. But familiarity bred opportunity, and Ethan Rodriguez was nothing if not resourceful. The holographic revelations from his guard had done more than provide context. They had given him insights, subtle weaknesses in the ship's defensive protocols, patterns in the energy field that contained him, small, almost imperceptible details that a less observant prisoner might have missed. Something was changing in their dynamic. The guard, whose name he still didn't know, had begun to treat him less like a specimen and more like a potential intelligence worth understanding. Her visits became longer, her scanning devices more conversational than invasive. During one critical interaction, Ethan noticed a momentary disruption in the ship's energy field, a microsecond of vulnerability that most would have overlooked. "Your technological systems have a fascinating quantum synchronization," he observed casually, watching her reaction. Her amber gold eyes flickered, not just a look, a genuine moment of assessment. "Quantum entanglement is a complex navigational protocol," she responded, her harmonic voice carrying a hint of something new. Pride, caution. Ethan had learned to read between the lines, between the frequencies of her communication. "Complexity always implies potential vulnerability," he said, a statement that hung in the air between them. For the first time, she didn't immediately dismiss his observation. Instead, she studied him, not with the clinical detachment of earlier encounters, but with something more nuanced. Curiosity, respect. The ship's internal systems began to shift, a subtle vibration that suggested something was changing, something big. "Your species has a remarkable capacity for adaptation," she said, her fingers dancing across a crystalline control panel. "Most captured specimens would have submitted, broken." Ethan smiled, a genuine, knowing smile. Submission was never an option. Another system flutter, another moment of potential vulnerability. He realized they were engaged in a complex dance, not just of potential escape, but of mutual understanding. Each movement, each word, a carefully calculated step. The guard moved closer, close enough that he could see the intricate biological circuitry etched into her skin, close enough to understand that this was more than a simple prisoner-guard relationship. "You have been studying our systems," she stated, not an accusation, an observation. "As you've been studying me," Ethan countered. A microsecond of what might have been amusement flickered in her eyes. Mutual observation, then. The ship's energy field began to destabilize, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that something fundamental was shifting. A change was coming. Ethan knew escape was possible, but escape was no longer the only goal. Something more complex was emerging, a connection that transcended the traditional boundaries of captor and captive. "What happens next?" he asked. Her response was unexpected. "That depends on how well you understand the difference between escape and true freedom." The energy around him shifted. The containment field wavered, an invitation, a test. Ethan Rodriguez understood one thing with absolute clarity: nothing was as it seemed, and the next moments would define everything. New horizons. The moment of decision arrived with a silence more profound than any sound Ethan Rodriguez had ever experienced. The ship's internal systems hummed with a tension that felt almost sentient, a living breath suspended between possibility and inevitability. His guard stood before him, the crystalline control panel reflecting light in impossible geometric patterns. Something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. They were no longer simply captor and captive, but something far more complex. "Freedom is not a destination," she said, her harmonic voice carrying a depth of meaning that transcended simple communication. "It is a negotiation." Ethan understood now that escape was never just about physical liberation. It was about understanding, about bridging gaps that seemed insurmountable. The ship's energy field began to reconfigure, not breaking down but transforming. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting from solid metal to something more akin to liquid light. Ethan realized this vessel was more than a transportation device. It was a living system of incredible complexity. "Your mission," the guard said, "was never truly about exploration." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of understanding. Ethan met her gaze. Some missions are about more than physical discovery, they're about connecting, understanding. Her ears, those delicate, translucent appendages, twitched in a gesture he now recognized as deep contemplation. "You entered a zone of historical conflict, intentionally." The holographic displays around them shifted, revealing layers of interstellar history, territorial disputes, misunderstandings that had calcified into generations of separation. Ethan's mission had been about something far deeper than simple cartography. "We needed to break the cycle," he explained. "Conflict perpetuates itself through isolation, through the belief that difference means threat." For the first time, something that might have been close to a smile flickered in her eyes. Not a human smile, something uniquely her own, a recognition, an acknowledgement. The ship's systems continued to reconfigure. The containment field around Ethan dissolved, not as a surrender, but as a deliberate choice. An invitation. "You will not return to your previous mission," she stated, not a threat, a new understanding. Ethan nodded. Some journeys change you fundamentally. The ship around them began to transform. No longer a place of containment, but a bridge. A meeting point between two civilizations that had existed in isolation for generations. His guard, no longer just a guard, but something more, extended a hand. 4 long fingers with an iridescent membrane, a gesture of connection that went beyond any traditional understanding of diplomacy. "We have much to discuss," she said. And in that moment, Ethan understood that this was never about escape. It was about something far more important: communication, understanding, the delicate art of building bridges between worlds that seemed impossibly different. The universe expanded around them. not with the cold emptiness of space, but with the warmth of possibility. A new journey was beginning.